Hi, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire drawing process of this cherry drawing using color pencils. So let's get started. As always, these are the art supplies I'm going to use for this drawing, and you can pause the video right here to note them down. I'm using this 250 GSM paper from my ordinary smooth surface sketchbook, which is available in almost all the art stores or stationeries around the world. So you don't have to use any fancy paper for this specific drawing. And the drawing portion area is 6 × 9 inches. Before moving on to the grid making process, let's mask the edges of this drawing paper using a masking tape to prevent the colors from spilling over the borders. I drew the outline using grid method, and you can find the detailed step-by-step process from making the grid to outlining on my Patreon profile. Link is in the description. Before moving on to the shading or coloring process, let's lightly erase the grid so that it doesn't peek through the future layers. Okay, so I'm shifting towards the background coloring, and for that I'm firstly adding a lighter green 171 in the center of the stem on this top left portion, and then creating depth around it using darker green 168. I'm also adding a tint of yellow 102 over the whole stem portion very carefully. Now let's add a base layer in the rest of the background portion, and for that I'm using maroon 217. Notice that I'm keeping a very low angle and pressure on my color while adding this layer. And now to build up the color, I'm layering more color over the required areas. This layering will help us in achieving a smooth layer without destroying the tooth of the paper. I am layering less color on the left side because we will be layering black over it. And by the way, you can get access to our premium content and support this channel through Patreon. You can sign up through different membership levels and get access to all the outlines and grid references, etc. We have an ever-growing library of hundreds of exclusive and real-time tutorials. And you will also get access to 4 new tutorials every month. You can also post your artworks in our active community of patrons and participate in our weekly critique sessions, where I give my honest and positive critiques on your artworks, so you can improve your skills and get better with your drawing. Visit the link in description and become a premium member today. It has always been my goal to provide free tutorials and information on drawing and art related tools to general public. And keeping with that theme, I would like to thank all these incredible individuals who backed our channel on Patreon last month. Their generous support enabled me to produce this free tutorial for all of you guys. Now it's time to add the contrast, and for that I'm using a black color with a round tip. I'm moving my hand in small circular motions while adding this layer to achieve soft and blended edges. And notice that I'm adding more layers with relatively higher pressure on the areas which are darker in the reference image, and gradually decreasing it for the lighter portions to achieve the required gradient. Now I'm shading this small portion using the red 219 to blend the black, along with adding a slight tint to the area. And keep on layering black onto this left portion until you achieve the required darkness. The top portion has a hint of yellow, so I'm adding it using a 109 color. I'm also adding depth around the stem using a darker green 168 to give it a more realistic look. I'm also retouching this maroon portion, and look how bright it has started to look. Okay, so now let's blend this stem portion, and for that I'm using my blender pencil and going over this whole area. The background of this left portion is still looking dull to me, so I'm adding another layer of black over it. You can skip this step if your drawing looks just fine as we need here. Now I'm adding a tint of maroon over the required portions using a 217 shade. And when the 3D base is done, start blending it using blender pencil to achieve a smooth and even layer. Now moving on to the right portion, and I'm following the similar shading and blending process as we did earlier for the left portion. Okay, so let's shade the stem, and for that I'm using green 168 and adding a base layer by keeping the pressure variable. I'm applying higher pressure for the darker areas and gradually decreasing it as I move towards the lighter ones. This will help us in achieving a 3D base which is perfect for realistic drawings. Now let's fill the remaining portion using a light green 171. And don't forget to maintain a low angle to achieve a blended look. Okay, so now it's time to add the shadows, and for that I'm using green 168 and layering the color on the top left side of the stem. I'm also adding a tint of maroon along the left edge of the stem. And keep on layering different tones until you achieve your desired base. Now it's time to add the highlights, and for that I'm firstly picking up the excessive color using Mono Zero Eraser and then using a perfection eraser to give it a more natural and blended effect. Okay, so let's shade the cherry, and for that I'm using red 119 and filling the required portion. Make sure to use the pressure technique while adding a base layer, as it will help you achieving a 3D base in less layers. And notice that I'm keeping the direction of the strokes in mind and adding a base layer in respective direction to achieve a 3D base. And keep on following the natural curve of the cherry while layering red to enhance the sense of roundness. And don't forget to apply higher pressure for the darker areas and then gradually decrease it for the lighter ones. Along with that, make sure to keep the tip of your color round to avoid uneven patchy surfaces. And keep on adding base layer until you are fully satisfied with the required color. Okay, so when the red base is in its place, it's time to add the shadows, and I've already defined their placement earlier. I'm using black color and firstly going over this portion in between these two cherries. And notice that I'm keeping the pressure high in the start and filling the area to achieve dense color. And now gradually decreasing it to achieve a blended look. I'm following the similar process for the bottom left portion as well. I'm also darkening some of the strokes we have added earlier for the cherry texture using the same black color. Also notice that I've created a chisel tip and now using the flat end of the color pencil to color these areas smoothly. I'm also adding some irregular slant strokes and lines to mimic the cherry texture. But make sure to keep the pressure and angle on your pencil very low to achieve a smooth and blended texture. Now for the top portion of the cherry, I'm adding these soft strokes close together to create a blended contrast. And for the area near the stem, I'm increasing the pressure and darkening the strokes at the base of the stem. I'm also adding shadows at the bottom of the water droplet to give them more dimension and shape. Now moving on to the cherry at the bottom, and I'm adding shadows by following the similar process as I did earlier. And now when the shadows are in its place, it's time to blend them. And for that, I'm using a maroon 142 and going over the bottom cherry. I'm applying higher pressure and moving my hand in circular motions. This layer will effectively blend the previous layers by adding a slight tint of maroon to it. And it will also fill in empty spots, if any, along with smoothing out the base layer. Now moving on to the next cherry, and I'm following the similar process of adding a layer of maroon color over the darker texture. And make sure to move your hand in the direction of the texture, and it will effectively blend the darker texture with the red base. Now for the lighter areas, I'm switching my maroon 142 color with the red 126 and going over the areas where I need a hint of red in the shadowed portions. The darker texture near the stem looks a bit dull to me, so I'm adjusting it using my black color. I'm also following the similar layering process for cherry on the right side of the drawing as well. Okay, so now let's move on to the stem portion, and first of all I'm extending the green base layer using same 168 color as we did earlier, and now adding a hint of bright green color where required using the color 171. The bottom portion of the stem has some yellowish color, so to mimic such an effect I'm using 109 and going over this required portion. I'm going back and adjusting the darkness as I was not satisfied with the results. Okay, so it's time to add the darker details, and I'm adding these mixture of straight strokes and dots. I'm using dark green 173 and applying relatively higher pressure. Now I'm switching my color and adding these small dots of variable sizes and shapes in these empty areas. Now it's time to add the contrast, and for that I'm using a chisel tip black color and going over this darker texture we just added. Okay, so now it's time to bring this whole portion into life by adding highlights. And for that, I'm firstly adding softer base highlights and using my perfection eraser. I have created a round yet sharp tip, and now carefully picking up the color from the portions I want to make shiny. And look how these intricate strokes made the water droplet appear separate from the surface of this cherry. I'm also adding these blended highlights to make the top of the cherry shiny. And now it's time to add defined highlights, and for that I'm using my flat tip Mono Zero Eraser. I'm carefully going over some of these base highlights and adding a mixture of strokes and blended highlights where required. And this blend of brighter and softer highlights will give more dimension to this whole area. I'm also adding a bright dot of a highlight using my electric razor to make the water droplet more 3D and realistic. I'm following the similar highlighting process for this droplet on the left as well. This top left portion has some missing darker texture. So I'm using a maroon color and adding these random shaped dots to mimic the water effect. Now let's top it off with this intricate highlight using a sharp tip electric razor. Okay, now moving on to the next droplet, and I'm mainly creating it using my electric razor. I'm adding these bright curved lines and then blending the edges without turning the razor on. And look how beautiful this droplet turned out. Now coming back to the cherry, and I'm using my electric razor and going over some of these previous highlights to make them appear more bright and shiny. Now I'm using my perfection razor and adding these curved strokes in between the darker ones to create a cherry texture. I'm adding the similar curved strokes texture in between the darker ones for the top portion as well. Now moving on to the background bokeh effect, and for that I'm creating these circles using a perfection razor. I'm applying higher pressure where I need brighter dots and reducing it for the softer ones. And this will create an effect of some in front and some at the back. Now let's make some of these dots more prominent, and for that I'm using my Mono Zero razor. I was not satisfied with the brightness of Mono Zero razor highlights, so I'm now shifting towards my electric razor. I'm going over the previous highlights along with adding some new ones where required. And keep on adding these small dots using your eraser until you are fully satisfied with the results. Now some of the dots lack a reddish tint, so I'm going over them with a red color and keeping the pressure light. Okay, now coming back to the cherry, and it is missing some brighter highlights. So for that I'm using my electric razor and picking up this excessive color from these lighter portions. And look how these highlights made the cherry look more shiny and realistic. Notice that I'm adding a mixture of brighter strokes and dots to mimic the shiny surface of this cherry. I'm now blending the edge of the highlight we have just added using a perfection razor, and it will effectively blend the edges with the surroundings. Okay, now moving on to this stem, and it has some blended as well as sharp highlights, for which I'm using my erasers to mimic such an effect. These fine textural strokes I just added using my electric razor seems a bit sharp to me. So I'm now adding a layer of green to make them more subtle. And now using my Mono Zero razor to add some strokes to mimic the stem texture. Okay, now moving back to the cherry, and let's add these subtle strokes of texture. And I'm following the similar process of texturing as I did earlier for the left side. I'm firstly adding these base strokes using a perfection razor along the curvature of the upper portion. I'm also adding this curved stroke to give the illusion of roundness to the top portion. And to add some more dimension to the texture, I'm adding these brighter strokes using my Mono Zero razor. I'm adjusting some highlights using the red color so that it blends beautifully with the surrounding instead of looking too whitish. Keep on adding this cherry texture using the same perfection razor first. And now use the tip of the perfection razor to make tiny irregular marks mimicking the natural texture and unevenness on the cherry skin. If some of the highlights are looking white or too bright, you can easily adjust them by shading them with the red color. The cherry on the right side has a very subtle texture, so I'm using my perfection razor and adding these dots of random sizes. Now I'm adding a tint of red over the highlights we just added, just like the way I did earlier for the previous cherry. And moving on to the cherry at the bottom, and I'm following the similar texturing process using a perfection razor, just like the way I did earlier. For the water droplets, I'm adding brighter strokes using my Mono Zero razor first, following the same steps we followed on the upper water droplets. And now when the base highlights and texture are in its place, it's time to add the final touches, for which I'm using my electric razor and adding these brighter dots and strokes on the water droplets first. And look how these small details made the droplets and cherry look realistic and 3D. The main cherry has some brighter shiny highlights, so for that I'm going over the previous highlights to make them pop up even more. I'm also adding some new highlights in between the previous ones to make the area more detailed. Notice that I'm adding these small dots close together to mimic this required texture. And while working on the hyper-realistic drawing, you can always go back and adjust the details where required to achieve your desired results. And with this last step, we are done with this super easy and interesting cherry drawing. Creating these free drawing tutorials needs a significant amount of time and energy. So if you found this one valuable, please show your support by liking this video. Your support keeps me inspired to bring you more creative content. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.